All right, Isaiah chapter 2, a passage that I have traditionally called 2 days, understanding that it seems to describe the latter days in roughly the first, I think it's 6 verses, as it is going to go on, really the first 5 verses, as it is going to go on from verse 6 through the end of the chapter to describe a day for God's judgment. That second section breaking down into 3 subsections where he is going to describe the way in which they are living today, the wealth that they are enjoying, as he's going to go on from verses 6 through roughly 11 that describe that day to another day where he is going to judge them for the ways in which they have misused the gifts or the blessings and the wealth that they now enjoy, as he is finally going to go on in verses 20 through the end of the chapter to describe the way in which they will respond to God's judgment in that day, really helping us to understand the peace that the first 5 verses describe for us. A day in which their idols will no longer stand in the way of them understanding the ways in which they can have success without disturbing the peace that God requires. Within that section of verses describing the day of the Lord's judgment, though, in that first section of verses, as we mentioned, running roughly from verse 6 through 11, verses 7 and 8 describe the way in which, as we mentioned, the land is filled with silver and gold and treasures. But verse 8, it is also filled with idols, the work of their hands. That second section, the thing that caught my attention was the way in which, in the day of the Lord's judgment, verses 12 through roughly 19, the thing that the verses most seem to describe God dealing with is pride. And in that last section of verses, verses 20 through 22, describing their response to God's judgment, is going to be a statement that we seem to see in each of the 3 sections describing the day of the Lord's judgment. Verse 21 reading, the way in which they will enter into the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty when he rises to terrify the earth. Super similar to what we'll see in verse 19, the previous section describing the day of the Lord, where it talks about the way in which they will enter the caves of the rocks and the holes of the ground from before the terror of the Lord. Super similar to what we saw in the first section, verse 10, where it says they will enter into the rock and hide in the dust from before the terror of the Lord. All 3 of those verses being super similar to the way in which the Revelation describes the response to the day of the Lord. The Revelation seeming to describe a final day of the Lord's judgment. But the thing that might have most caught my attention about these 2 days this time are the idols. Specifically 2 things. One, the process by which the idols seem to be made and the purpose for which they are made. Verse 8 describing what I would describe as their process when it says their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. Toward the end of the chapter, verse 20, describing what I would call the purpose of their crafting or their work on these idols, when it says, in that day, mankind will cast away their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves. And I'm going to stop reading the rest of it because it says for themselves to worship. But the reason why process and purpose stood out to me is the way in which, if we get past the word idols and quite possibly substitute the word images, we can understand how we may still be doing this today. Understanding the way in which, with our own hands, we still craft images of people that don't necessarily represent who they really are, often for the purpose of seeing an idealized version of ourselves winning in some way, or creating the image of one capable of promoting our own interests. Images we often promote without regard to the way in which our personal idols destabilize the peace of us all. A peace that, once he has cleansed us of our idols in his day of judgment, he promises to restore in the latter days. Moving forward, days Isaiah will encourage Israel or Judah to prepare for so that they are not swept away in the days of judgment. A warning that seems super similar to warnings that God offers even through the days of the revelation.